Thank you for joining us. I'm your host, Molly Dacey, and for this episode, I'd like to welcome Baroness Louise Casey. Baroness Casey is an independent advisor for social welfare, crime, homelessness, and inclusion and diversity, along with a range of other topical issues. A former British government official, Louise worked on issues relating to social welfare for 5 prime ministers over the last 25 years. She was made head of the Rough Sleepers Unit in 1999, where she successfully led the strategy to reduce the number of people living on the streets by 2/3. Baroness Casey went on to hold several leadership positions, including the director of the National Antisocial Behaviour Unit, the Respect Task Force, and the Troubled Families Programme, as well as being the UK's first Victims Commissioner. She left the civil service in 2017 to establish the Institute for Global Homelessness and returned to Whitehall in 2020, where she led the government's COVID-19 rough sleeping response and ran the Everyone In strategy, getting over 6,000 homeless people off the streets and into safe accommodation. More recently, she has spent over 12 months with the Metropolitan Police in London, undertaking a review into culture and standards, published in March 2023. Thank you so much for joining us, Louise. To begin, if it's okay with you, I'd like to ask you some quick fire questions just so our listeners can get to know you a bit better.
Okay, dreading those, but yes.
What was the last book that you read?
Last book that I read is the latest Curtin Sittenfield called Romantic Comedy.
And would you recommend it?
Highly. It's in hardback at the moment, so slightly pricey, but it will be in paperback very soon. I love her books. They're fantastic.
It's always good to get the recommendations in. I've got a long list by now. What was the last thing that you learned?
Last thing that I learned an awful lot about policing when I worked on the Metropolitan Police Review, from, how tasers are used or shouldn't be used, through to all of the body armour that they now have to wear and things like that. So I know much, much more about the life of an actual police officer than I did a year ago.
What is your greatest strength?
Greatest strength? I think empathy. And in some ways I'm not sure it's a strength. I hold on to it being a strength, but I think for all sorts of reasons I do feel for people. And I, on a personal level, I think that there's a lot about listening to people, and not just listening to what they're saying, but listening to how they're saying it and what's going on in their lives, and, why it's important that we help them. Because I'm a public servant, so, most of my life, like everybody else in Academy Wales, we're all public servants, and so we are called upon, and we call upon ourselves to do the things that the rest of society don't always want to do.
Yeah, that kind of links into what motivates you.
Good God. Well, I think what motivates me is fairness, equality, justice, a sense that wherever you're born, you don't choose where you're born and what you're born into. And that casts the die, really, the dice or whatever, on how then you live your life. And I think that, therefore, I think fairness and driving to give everybody some sort of fighting chance to live their best life, to live with dignity and love and without crime and so on and so forth. I think that's what drives me, yeah.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
God, that's a fantastic question. I'd probably want to, if profession-wise, I'd have a go at being a social worker.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah, I would, yeah.
Thank you for answering those. It's lovely just to get to know a bit more about you. We can tell from the introduction that you have an amazing leadership story, but something to note is that almost all of your work has been with vulnerable people in sensitive situations, and that's why our theme for this episode is compassionate leadership. So, in your opinion, why is compassion an essential trait for an effective leader, and how does it impact dynamics of just overall organisational success?
God, well, I think, if you think about a lot of what public service is, we are all, that's why I love Academy Wales, and I love what people in public service are trying to do here in Wales, which is to have one Wales, one public service. And I think what unites us all is a sense that what we are all here for is to deliver services to the public. Now, when that's libraries or taking the bins away, that may seem straightforward. As long as we have libraries, we still have some in Wales. But actually, what's interesting is even the services that people think aren't there for vulnerable people. When I was in Rotherham and did the inspection into child sexual exploitation, as they called themselves, bin men came forward to tell me what they knew was happening in some of the children's homes. And the broken men sat in my room, broken in that they were deeply upset, in that they had tried to tell people what was going on, and they as grown men weren't heard. So I think, that's a real eyes and ears service, isn't it, in many ways. And then you think about libraries and think, what on God's name would we do if people couldn't afford a hardback Kurt's Sittenfield to read?
Yeah.
Isn't that a privilege that I can go out because I adore her and get a book as soon as it comes out? How lucky am I? But as a kid, we wouldn't have been able to read without a library in a school. And so I think, then you come to the fact that some public services, and I'm going to talk about it today, I think are so important that we understand and empathise and have compassion for the people that we are working with. And when we forget that, we forget what our public service is. So it really, really matters. I met a woman, a mother the other evening, whose son was murdered, and the probation people had called her because he's now coming out of prison, only 5 years, because he was a youngster, and he killed another youngster. And you could almost hear, when she was retelling the story, I could hear the sort of fear of the probation officer in my mind, because she, of course, got really upset and said, you can't send him back to Liverpool. I live in Liverpool. You promised that you wouldn't do that. Like, what's going to happen? And she got really upset and really angry. And so what the guy did was hang up the call and then email her to say, we're going to restrict our contact with you due to you being angry and upset. And I thought to myself, it's a really interesting example, actually not even thinking about this, but it's yet another example of where actually we thought for a minute, if my child was murdered, I think I would scream for the rest of my life. Because the injustice of that is beyond anything. Like, human beings aren't supposed to kill each other. It's a really different thing to die from illness. Or, it's bad enough when a child dies and the mother is still living. Your children are supposed to outlive you. That's the deal in life. And when that doesn't happen, that upsets the order of things. But imagine if that person was killed by another human being. And so actually, we should be able to explain to guys that make those calls, they're going to be phenomenally angry. Yeah. You're going to have to suck it up. Like, imagine what it would feel like if it was your child. And I know it's a very recent and specific example because it was Wednesday night, but I think when we forget... I met a friend of mine works in A&E in the second largest accident emergency department, and she's a nurse. And she said someday she thinks the doctors forget that A&E exists to have the kind of saddest, toughest part of humanity to walk through its door. It is the last road for so many people, to do with mental health, to do with homelessness, as well as they turn up covered in sweat, covered in shit, covered in blood. And, that's what humanity is. Yeah. And of course it would run better if everybody was a Bupa patient that could, wander in with their nice clothes and say, I've broken my toe. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And I think when we forget what we're here for, which is a deep sense of what should drive us into public service, then we get a reaction from the public that then reinforces that negativity. So if we start with knowing that in public service, compassion is the central part of what we are here to do, we are paid by the public to be compassionate towards them. That's the bottom line.
Yeah. it's
Sorry,
kind of...
I've probably ruined all your other questions.
No, not at all.
Sorry, Molly.
Because it's quite clear from your introduction, but also what you've just said, is that you've just had to work in quite demanding roles and demanding situations. So how can leaders maintain their compassionate approach in a challenging time, but try and maybe not get emotionally overwhelmed and hit that balance of compassion, but still not?
I think that's, again, it's a really tough balance, because on the one hand, I've worked with people and I've been down this route myself, where your belief that you can change the world, your belief that every single client, patient, worker matters, can almost be overwhelming because of what people are experiencing. In my life, it's homelessness, it's victims. I'm currently up to my eyes in food poverty, which is a nice way of describing people that are going hungry and turning up at food banks, and the loneliness that they experience. So, again, on Wednesday, I was busy on Wednesday, I went to a food bank and to help them publish and promote, because I can now, some of their work. And little known fact buried in the report, not in the press notice, was that 25%, i.e. 1 in 4 people coming to a food bank, have not been with their family or friends for a month. That tells you about isolation, doesn't it? And I think one can get really upset by that. And that's okay when you're at home. You're okay to be upset once you clock off, as it were. And it's really important to go back to normality. I was talking to somebody over breakfast and they said, some guy here, a leadership person, had said, when you go home, give 4 minutes to anybody you walk through the door to and just listen to them and it'll change your mode. And we were joking about one of the guys had a 6-year-old daughter. When he asked those questions, he went, Daddy, what on earth are you asking those questions for? So, we can be good on theory, the leadership people that come to places like this, but the reality is sometimes different. Yeah. But I thought that was really interesting, because I genuinely believe that you have to be able to look after your staff. Well-being is as important for your staff and your volunteers and for yourself, in order to make sure you're replenished, in order to then go and be the public servant and give. So when you clock off, you do have to clock off, and you do have to be with people. I mean, have a glass of rosé in my case sometimes, or, read a book, or, go out and do something different, go for a walk, stare at the stars, Otherwise, I think you will burn yourself out. Yeah.
And some leaders may not have employed a compassionate leadership approach and won't have any idea kind of where to start. So can you provide any insights into specific strategies or techniques that leaders can use just to enhance their compassionate leadership skills?
Do you know what? I do now have a view about this, actually, because I think what's really interesting, and that's why I love this particular event, because I think it's really okay to ask people, are they married? Do they live alone? Do they have kids? Do they have parents? What do they like watching on the telly? I mean, just a little bit of getting to know people is okay in a team. Yeah. Because we went through a phase where I think we thought we all had to be so boundaried that actually you could never ask about anybody's personal life. Somehow that was off limits. Well, I think it's on limits, because you have to have a sense of the stretch in people's lives, and you have to be able to listen and say to them, it's okay to say, like, I head from here down to Port Talbot to see a 93-year-old and a 91-year-old, and it's okay that the people know I'll leave at 11 sharp, so I can go and do that. It's not a failing in me, it's just how I'm managing my day. Yeah. And I think we went too right on at a certain point in the public sector, which is you can't ask those questions because... So I think just knowing the basics, and everybody know, and people don't want to share those basics. They don't want to share those basics. Yeah. They might be private people, but you're asking them those questions, not because you're nosy, but because you care. And I think saying, look, I care about you, and I want to make sure we all look after each other in this team. So why don't we do a little bit of getting to know each other on, 2 or 3 questions, like you've just done at the beginning of this podcast, those sorts of questions. And then happy days, knowing somebody, do I bring them tea in the morning or do I bring them coffee in? Yeah. Simple. It's not prying, it's just, I'm going to bring you a cup of something in when I come in. What do you want me to bring in?
Yeah. And my last question is, do you have any advice for future leaders?
Well, I think, I believe nowadays it's called authenticity. I bet that word's come up a lot this week. I mean, I think it's be yourself and be confident in the fact you're a public servant. And that's a really important thing to hold dear into your heart and into your head and into the way you do your job. That public service is preeminent in our society and it's much overlooked and taken for granted. And I think it's really important that people are themselves and they are proud of being public servants.
Thank you so much for your stories and advice today. Just before we end, I'd like to ask you a few more quick fire questions, if that's okay. Do you or have you ever played a musical instrument?
Yes.
What is it?
Piano.
And do you still play?
No, but I play the spoons.
Maybe you can give us a little rendition before you leave. What is your favourite?
My school had 3 pianos.
3 pianos.
And that's how that happened.
When did you stop playing?
When I discovered tennis.
Oh.
Yeah. We had a tennis court, and so spare time went to that rather than knocking out the piano. So probably about 11.
Oh. What is your favourite type of food?
Oh, good God, that's a really good question. I like ham, egg and chips. It's got to be done, isn't it? It's a classic. Big tea, white bread, little sandwich with your chips and then the ham and egg on the side. That's my dream meal.
I'm glad we've just had breakfast because otherwise
we'd be off, wouldn't we?
Starving.
Finding a motorway cafe somewhere. Not that there are motorways here, of course, God forbid.
What is your favourite noise?
People laughing. It's absolutely my favourite noise. I don't think there's anything like listening to people laugh.
And it's contagious.
Totally, I absolutely love it. It's joyful. And you can laugh in the face of enormous adversity, and I think that will always prick a tear and prick a laugh at the same time.
Are you more of a morning person or a night owl?
Morning.
Have you always been a morning person?
No, I don't think I have actually. And actually, I've had 5 COVIDs. So 5 COVIDs down, I really struggle to get up and out in the morning.
Oh God.
So I was much. So I guess. So then I work slightly. So sometimes I work in the evenings now because I know like I'll want to sleep until 9 o'clock in the morning from 11 o'clock at night.
Oh,
I know.
And my last question is: if you could have one superpower, what would it be?
Oh God. To make sure every kid in this country wasn't hungry.
Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed the experience.
It's great, Molly. Thank you very much for having me on your podcast.
Mae un podlediad Sgwrsiau ar Arweinyddiaeth ar gael trwy ein gwefan. Mae'r hawlfraint y podlediad yma yn cael ei gadw gan Llywodraeth Cymru. Our Conversations on Leadership podcast is available through our website. Copyright of this podcast is held by the Welsh Government.